Section 201 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. No Man is Indispensable. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. No man is indispensable. One of the cabinet ministers disagreed with the majority on a vital question, and rose with a threat to resign. One of his friends advised the chairman to do anything to recover his aid, whereupon he sagely said, "Our secretary a national necessity? How mistaken you are! Yet it is not strange. I used to have similar notions. No, if we should all be turned out tomorrow, and could come back here in a week, we should find our places filled by a lot of fellows doing just as well as we did, and in many instances better." It was the truth that the Irishman uttered when he answered the speaker, "Is not one man as good as another?" with, "He is, sure, and a deal better." No, sir, this government does not depend on the life of any man. End of section 201. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 202 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Sleeping on Post Cancels a Commission. Nobody who met Secretary Stanton, the Carnot of the war, would give him credit for joking, but Mr. Lincoln's example that way was infectious. The eldest son, Robert, was at college, but a captaincy was waiting him when he could enter the army. So the War Secretary, for a pleasantry, issued a mock commission to Tad, ranking him as a regular lieutenant. As long as he confined his supposed duties to arming the under-servants and drilling them more or less fantastically, as well as he remembered, evolutions on the parade grounds, where he accompanied his father, all was amusing. But he terminated his first steps in the school of Hardy's tactics, the standard textbook of the period, by bringing his awkward squad from the servants' hall, and, relieving the sentries, replaced the genuine with these tyros. For the sake of the vacation, they, the regulars, bowed to the commission with its potent Stanton and Lincoln, and United States Army seal. His brother, startled, intervened, but the cadet vowed he would put him in the black hole, presumably the coal shed. The president laughed, and when he went to check the usurpation, he found the little lieutenant, overpowered by his brief authority, asleep. So he removed him from the service, put aside his commission, and, when he woke to the situation, made it plain that, being a real soldier and officer, he had forfeited his title by falling asleep on post. He went then and formally discharged the sham sentinels placed by the boy's orders, and replaced them by the Simon Peers. End of section 202. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 203 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. My Question. Read for LibriVox.org. A recent volume has undertaken the superfluous vindication of President Lincoln from being the mere ornamental figurehead of the Republic during the Civil War. In fact, there are many instances of his incurring the reproach of interfering with the chiefs of departments, but it is testified to by a leading minister that he paid much less attention to details than was popularly supposed and invidiously asserted in the Capitol. He brought up with a round turn, to use river language, both General Fremont and other military commanders who tried to steal the finishing weapon he kept in store, to wit, the emancipation of the Southern slaves. Senator Cameron, as War Secretary, advised in a report that the slaves should be armed to enable them successfully to rise against their masters. The President scratched out this recommendation, which would have spiked his gun, and perverted a great statesmanlike action into a fostered insurrection, saying, "This will never do. Secretary Cameron must take no such responsibility. This question belongs exclusively to me." End of section 200. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 204 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. If good, he's got it. If 'tain't good, he ain't got it. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. A revenue cutter conveyed a presidential party from Washington to Fortress Monroe, consisting of the chief, his secretaries of war and of treasury, and General Egbert L. Veely, who preserved this tale. On the way, Secretary Stanton stated that he had telegraphed to General Mitchell in Alabama, "All right, go ahead," though he did not know what emergency was thus to meet. He wished the executive to take the responsibility in case his ignorance erred. "I will have to get you to countermand the order," so he hinted. "Well," exclaimed the good-humored superior, "that is very much like a certain horse sale in Kentucky when I was a boy." Lincoln was only 8 when leaving Kentucky for Indiana. A particularly fine horse was to be sold, and the people gathered together. They had a small boy ride the horse up and down while the spectators examined it for points. At last one man whispered to the boy as he went by, "Look here, boy, ain't that hoss got the splints?" The boy replied, "Master, I don't know what the splints is, but if it is good for him, he has got it. If it ain't good for him, he ain't got it." "Now," finished the adviser, "if this was good for Mitchell, it was all right, but if it was not, I have to countermand, eh?" Noted by General V. Lee. End of section 204. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 3, 2009.
Section 205 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Lincoln Guessed the First Time. Read for LibriVox.org. Postmaster General James reflects a dialogue between Lincoln and one of his cabinet officers, evincing how the iron hand in the velvet glove squeezed persons into his own mold. "Mr. President," Secretary Staunton speaking, "I cannot carry out that order. It is improper, and I don't believe it is right." "Well, I reckon, Mr. Secretary," very gently, "that you will have to carry it out." "But I won't do it. It's all wrong." "I guess you will have to do it." He guessed right the first time. End of section 205. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 206 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A Phantom Chase. Despite Chase's political enmity to him, President Lincoln said of Salmon Portland Chase, "I consider him one of the best, ablest, and most reliable men in the country." But he had to let him slide off upon the Supreme Court bench to have knee room at the council table. He explained, "He wants to be president, and, if he does not give that up, it will be a great injury to him and a great injury to me. He can never be president. Ex-Secretary Boutwell, The Authority." End of section 206. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 207 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Word Flies, but the Writ Remains. Read for LibriVox.org by Megan Kunkel. The word flies, but the writ remains. Mr. Chase, bemoaning that in leaving home he had in the hurry forgot to write a letter, Lincoln sagely consoled, "Chase, never regret what you don't write. It is what you do write that you are often called upon to feel sorry for." Heard by General Veal. End of section 207. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 208 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Warlord. Read for LibriVox.org by Captain Allegra. Lincoln states that the community among whom he was brought up would have hailed him as a wizard who spoke the dead tongues, and, granting his legal studies made him familiar with Latin as lawyers use it, he carefully avoided those hurdles of the classic orator, Latin quotations. Nevertheless, we have an exception to what would have pleased Lord Byron. The poet thought we have had enough of the classics. The President, spying Secretary Stanton of the War Department, inadvertently striking an imposing attitude in the doorway of the telegraph office in the Executive House, without knowing the President was here, at the desk, suddenly was aroused by hearing the jocose hail, "Good evening, Mars," certified by Mr. A. B. Chandler, Manager of the Postal Telegraph, War Department. End of section 208. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 209 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. File It Away. Read for LibriVox.org by Ernst Schnell. File It Away. Stanton, as Secretary of War, was bombarded with complaints and bickerings of the officers under him. They seemed to revel in annoying one famed for being of the irritable genus. Once he showed his principal a letter written in answer to a general who had abused him and accused him of favoritism. Lincoln listened with his quizzing air and exclaimed rapturously, "That's first-rate, Stanton. You've scored him well, just right." As the pleased writer folded up the paper for its envelope, he quickly inquired, "Why, what are you going to do with it now?" It was to be dispatched. No, that would spoil all. File it away. That is the kind of filing which keeps it sharp, and don't wound the other fellow. File it away. End of section 209. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 210 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. What We Have We Will Give You. Read for LibriVox.org by Megan Kunkel. What we have we will give you. It being rumored that the paper notes, the greenbacks, should bear a motto as the coin had, "In God We Trust," it was suggested to quote from the Apostles, "Silver and gold we have not, but what we have we will give." It was ascribed to Mr. Lincoln from his familiarity with the Scriptures and prevalent quoting from them. End of section 210. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 211 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. More shin plasters to heal the sore. Read for LibriVox.org. In 1863, President Lincoln went out to condole with the beaten Unionists, whom General Hooker had led fatally against Lee at Chancellorsville. Lincoln took his little son, Tad, with him. Amid the cheering, one of the soldiers plainly voiced a terrible grievance. Just when the sufferers were mostly in need of necessaries, the pay was behindhand. So one cried, "Send along more greenbacks, Father Abraham." The boy was puzzled, but his companion explained that the soldiers wanted their money due. The hearer thought this over for a moment, and then pertly said, "Why don't Governor Chase print some more?" End of section 211. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 212 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. There is much in an if and a but. Mr. Tinkler, telegraph operator of the cipher telegrams at Washington, in the executive residence, took the dispatch announcing the nomination of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee to the vice presidency with Lincoln for the second term. The latter read it carefully, and thought aloud, "Well, I thought possibly that he might be the man, but—" He passed out of the office, leaving the hearer impressed. Indeed, it was a prophecy of the future. Poor inebriate Andy, not the handy Andy, but the merry Andrew of the fag end of the lamentably sundered second term. Charles A. Dana, editing the New York Sun, printed this drop line, and said it was a proof that Lincoln had no hand in his vice being proposed or nominated. End of section 212. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 213 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Don't waste the plug, but use it. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. Don't waste the plug, but use it. Treasurer Chase conducted the financial course of the war on the principle of each day taking care of itself. But still he resisted plans for relief not of his own conception. So he threw cold water on the Walker suggestion that the currency should bear interest with a view that holders would hoard it. Walker said Taylor of Ohio ran to the President for a higher hearing. But though the President now espoused the scheme, the Secretary still was counter on the ground that the Constitution was against it. "Taylor," said Lincoln, with his frankness, which resembled impiety now, "go back and tell Chase not to bother about the Constitution. I have the sacred instrument here, and am guarding it with great care." But a personal discussion with Chase was compulsory, during which the granite man stood on the Constitution. "Chase," finally said the decisive factor, "this reminds me of a little sea yarn." A little coaster on the Mediterranean was in stress of storm. The Italian seamen have their own ideas of behaviour under disaster, and fell on their knees to invoke the interposition of the usual stronghold, the Madonna, of which there was a statue in wood. But many and genuine as were the invocations, all were unanswered. The gale continued, and more damage was done the upper works, whereupon, in a rage, the skipper ordered the image to be hurled overboard. Strange to say, almost instanter the tempest lulled, and in a short time the bark rode steadily on the Pacific waters. Come to examine the leak in the side, they found the wooden effigy thrown over sucked into it and so plugged up the cavity. The ship was saved by the castaway notion. Now we're all aboard to save the ship, by any plug. Footnote. Plug in Western speech, any substitute, worthless otherwise, an old horse, a leaden counter, a makeshift, the plug hat, however, comes from the shape, a cylinder of tobacco being so called. End of footnote. That is offered. Since prayers don't seem to do it, let us try find a Musser Walker's proposition. End of section 213. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 214 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Running Fever. Read for LibriVox.org. There is a malady of vulnerable heels, a species of running fever, which operates on sound-headed and honest-hearted creatures, very much like the cork-leg in the song did on its owner. When he had once got started on it, the more he tried to stop it, the more it would run away. A witty Irish soldier always boasting of his bravery when no danger was nigh, but who invariably retreated without orders at the first charge of his engagement, being asked by his captain why he did so, replied, "Captain, I have as brave a heart as Julius Caesar ever had, but somehow or other, whenever danger approaches, my cowardly legs will run away with me." Debate. Lincoln. Springfield, Illinois, December, 1839. End of section 214. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 215 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. 1.5 times bigger than other men. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. Most conspicuous among the host of seeming friends consistently and constantly plotting against their chief to replace him, if not actually displace him, was Salmon P. Chase. His whole career was that of the office-seeker incarnate, schoolteacher, lawyer, governor of his state of adoption, Ohio, for he was a New Hampshire man. He tried from 1856 all parties to nominate him for the presidency, at all openings. His inability to inspire trust forbade him having a personal following of any strength. Lincoln easily saw through him, but he had a fellow feeling for an indubitably honest treasurer. To think of the countless opportunities he had to enrich himself out of the public coffers. Like another incorruptible statesman, he might have said, "I wonder at my qualms when I had but to stretch out my hand to pocket thousands." But he truthfully said, when a hack impudently hinted that he could have had the nomination dearest to his heart if he would but use to his private ends the vast patronage at his command, "I should despise myself if capable of appointing or removing a man for the sake of the presidency." In February 1861, the Peace Congress, Massachusetts, delegation called on the President to recommend Salmon P. Chase for the Treasury Department. Lincoln was already favorable, for he said, "From what I know and hear, I think Mr. Chase is about 150 to any other man's 100 for that place." This is why Lincoln, when compelled to remove the underminer, solaced him with the bed to fall upon of the Supreme Court judgeship. He said of him, "Chase is about 1.5 times bigger than anyone I ever knew." End of section 215. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 216 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. So slow a hearse ran over him. By treachery of those in charge of our navy yards, arsenals, and treasury, the South began the bloody strife better provided than the simple North, but adverse fate seemed bent on keeping the disparity for long in favor of the weaker contestant. By one of those wicked dispensations tripping up our early march, the Secretary of the Navy was selected in Gideon Welles, an estimable gentleman in person, but woefully unsuited to the berth if from age alone. Patriarchal in appearance, with a long face and longer beard, white and sere, it became proverbial without appearing much of a far-fetched joke that he was the naval constructor to Noah of archaic fame. Unfortunately his set were antiques as well, yet Lincoln clung to him, or he clung to the President, like the Old Man of the Sea, under which aspect he was presented by the caricaturists. One day, however, said the gossips of the White House, Mr. Lincoln dropped the newspaper in reading, and exclaimed, "Listen," said he to his secretary, "a man has been run over by a hearse! As I saw Welles not so long ago, it must be one of Gideon's band." A song entitled Gideon's Band, introduced by the Negro minstrels in New York, was popular on the streets and in the camps. End of Section 216. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 217 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Bloodshedding Remits Sins. Read for LibriVox.org. Judge Kellogg, having an application for condoning a death sentence against a soldier, urged that he had served well hitherto, having been badly wounded under fire. "Kellogg," remarked Lincoln quickly, "is there not something in the Bible about the shedding of blood for the remission of sins?" As the judge was not familiar with ecclesiastical law, he merely bowed. In fact, the blood offerings of the ancients was of animals, and it was deemed profane to offer one's own. Still, the offering of blood is a dedication to a friend or to the country. Lincoln had the idea correctly. "That's a good point," he brightly said, "and there is no going behind it." So saying, he wrote the pardon, which Kellogg transmitted to the gladdened father of the culprit. Mr. Lincoln had no need to go back to Scripture for his defense. It is martial law, unwritten but valid, that if a delinquent soldier, fugitive from justice, or breaking prison, reaches the battlefield and takes his place gallantly, no more would be said about the hanging charge, even though it were literally a hanging one. End of Section 217. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 218 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. His Leg Cases. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. The Judge Advocate General Holt, as well as the military chiefs, were in despair at their superior trifling with the laws of war by suspending mortal decrees, and in short, in hunting up excuses for delaying the blow of justice. Once the judge brought to the President a case so flagrant that he did not doubt that for a rarity the chief would sign without any cavil and hesitation. A soldier had demoralized his regiment in the nick of a battle by dashing down his rifle and hiding behind a tree. He had not a friend or relative to sue for him. Despite all this, the executive laid down the pen quivering between his long fingers and said, "Holt, I think I must, after all, file this away with my leg cases," and thrust the paper in one of a series of pigeonholes already crammed with the like. The judge was taken off his guard by the inconsistent levity and demanded the meaning of the term with acerbity. "Holt, were you ever in a battle?" he counter-queried. The man of law was a man of peace. He had seen lead, but in seals, not bullets. Secretary of War Stanton was spurring the military justice on, as often before. Did Stanton ever march in the first line to be shot at like this man? Holt answered for his colleague in the negative. "Well, I tried it in the Black Hawk War," proceeded the Illinoisian, "and I remember one time I grew awful weak in the legs when I heard the bullets whistle around me and saw the enemy in front of me. How my legs carried me forward I cannot tell, for I thought every minute that I should sink to the ground. I'm opposed to having soldiers shot for not facing danger when it is not known that their legs would carry them into danger. Well, Judge, you see, the papers crowded in there. You call them cases of cowardice in the face of the enemy, a long title, but I call them my leg cases, for short. And I put it to you, Holt, and leave it to you to decide for yourself. If Almighty God gives a man a cowardly pair of legs, how can he help them running away with him? End of section 218. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 3rd, 2009.
Section 219 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. How the Delinquent Soldier Paid His Debt. Read for LibriVox.org by Bill Elliott. Find me at www.vocability.com. That's VOCALBILLITY.com. How the Delinquent Soldier Paid His Debt. There is a great similarity in the many stories of Lincoln's leniency to soldiers incurring the death penalty according to the Code of War, and no wonder, when they were so numerous that he often had 24 sentences to sign or ignore in a day. A member of a Vermont regiment was so sentenced for sleeping at his post. The more than usual intercession made for him induced Lincoln to visit the culprit in his cell. He found him a simple country lad, impressing him as a reminder of himself at that age. In the like plain and rustic vein he discoursed with him. "I have been put to a deal of bother on your account, Scott," he said paternally. "What I want to know is how are you going to pay my bill?" From a lawyer-turned-sword of state, this was reasonable enough, so the young man responded, "I hope I am as grateful to you, Mr. Lincoln, as any man can be for his life. But this came so sudden that I did not lay out for it. But I have my bounty money in the savings bank, and I guess we could raise some money by a mortgage on the farm. And if we wait till payday for the regiment, I guess the boys will help some, and we can make it up. If it isn't more nor 500 or 600, eh?" With the same gravity, the intermediary reckoned the cost would be more. "My son," he said, "the bill is a large one. Your friends cannot pay it, nor your comrades, nor the farm, nor the pay. If from this day William Scott does his duty so that, if I were there when he came to die, he could look me in the face as now and say, 'I have kept my promise and have done my duty as a soldier,' then my debt will be paid." The boy made the promise and was immediately restored to the regiment. He earned promotion, but refused it. At Lee's Mills, on the Warwick River, he was wounded while distinguishing himself in a grand assault. Mortally wounded in saving 3 lives, he was enabled with his dying breath to send a message to the president to the effect that he had redeemed his pledge. On his breast was found one of the likenesses of Lincoln with the motto, "God bless our president," which the Grand Army men were given. He thanked the benefactor for having let him fall like a soldier in battle and not like a coward by his comrades' rifles. End of section 219. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 220 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The swearing had to be done then, or not at all. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. The swearing had to be done then, or not at all. An old man came from Tennessee to beg the life of his son, death doomed under the military code. General Fisk procured him admittance to the President, who took the petition and promised to attend to the matter. But the applicant, in anguish, insisted that a life was at stake, that tomorrow would not do, and that the decision must be made on the instant. Lincoln assumed his mollifying air, and in a soothing tone brought out his universal soothing syrup, the little story. "It was General Fisk who introduced you, who told me this. The general began his career as a colonel, and raised his regiment in Missouri. Having good principles, he made the boys promise then not to be profane, but let him do all the swearing for the regiment. For months no violation of the agreement was reported. But one day a teamster, with a foul tongue associated with their calling and mule driving, as he drove his team through a longer and deeper series of mud puddles than ever before, unable to restrain himself, turned himself inside out, as a vocal Vesuvius. It happened, too, that this torrent was heard surging by the Colonel, who called him to account. "Well, yes, Colonel," he acknowledged, "I did vow to let you do all the swearing of the regiment, but the cold fact is that the swearing had to be done thar and then, or not at all, to do the 'cation justice, and you were not thar." "Now," summed up Mr. Lincoln to the engrossed and semi-consoled parent, "I may not be there, so do you take this and do the swearing him off." He furnished him with a release autograph, and sent another mourner on his way rejoicing. End of section 220. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 221 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Displace the Thistles by Flowers. Read for LibriVox.org. Two ladies called upon the President at the end of 1864, one the wife, the other the mother of Western Pennsylvanians imprisoned for resisting the military draft. A number of other men were fellows in their durance on precisely the same grounds. Finding it meet to grant this dual relief sought, Lincoln directed the whole to be liberated, and signed the paper with one signature to cover the entire act of humanity. His old friend, Speed, was witness of this scene, and knowing only too well the sensitive nature of the President, he spoke his wonder that such ordeals were not killing. Lincoln mused, and agreed that such scenes were not to be wantonly undergone. "But they do not hurt me. That is the only thing to-day to make me forget my condition, or give me any pleasure." He was unwell then, his feet and hands were always cold, and often, when about, he ought to have been abed. "I have in that order made two persons happy, and alleviated the distress of many a poor soul whom I never expect to see. It is more than one can often say that, in doing right, one has made two happy in one day. Speed, die when I may, I want it said of me by those who knew me best, that I always plucked a thistle and planted a flower when I thought a flower would grow." Vouched for by Joshua R. Speed, the first to be friend to Lincoln when he set out to become a lawyer, at Springfield in 1837. End of section 221. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 222 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. You have one and I have one. That is right. An elderly woman was among the suitors of the President when the Commander-in-Chief, by virtue of office, was besought to release her eldest son of 3, her husband, and 2 younger sons having been slain in action. "Certainly," returned the chief. "If you have given us all, and your prop has been taken away, you are justly entitled to one of your boys." The woman took the discharge, and gratefully went away. But she was compelled to return more grieved than before, as she found the son she sought dying in a hospital at the front. The surgeon made a note of the fatality, with which, unable to speak, she presented herself to the President. He knew what she wished this time, and proceeded to write out the release of the second son. On handing her the paper, he said, a new judgment of a kinder judge than Solomon, "Now you have one, and I the other of the 2 left. That is no more than right." End of section 222. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 223 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Shooting a man does him no good. Read for LibriVox.org by Christine. Shooting a man does him no good. Judge Kellogg of New York begged off the son of a voter in his district, condemned for military infraction. In fact, the judge did not know much of the case, but his insistence prevailed over the rectifier of the law and articles of war. Lincoln dryly remarked, as he appended his signature to the pardon, "I do not believe that shooting a man does him any good." End of section 223.
Section 224 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Benevolence is Beautiful. Read for LibriVox.org. Thaddeus Stevens accompanied a lady of his constituents to beg a pardon of the President, her son being under death sentence of a court-martial. the senator backing up the petition, it was granted. The grateful woman was choking and was led away by her escort, without speaking in thankfulness. But at the exit she found her voice and burst forth feelingly, "Mr. Stevens, they told me that the President was homely looking. It is a lie. He is the handsomest man I ever saw." End of section 224. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 225 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. It Was the Baby That Did It. Read for LibriVox.org by Megan Kunkel. It was the baby that did it. A young mother came to Washington to sue for the life of her husband, a deserter, condemned to die. Such was the crowd of besiegers for grace, offices, and simple greeting by the host of the White House, that she was kept out in the hall. But one day, the master passing through the corridor to hold the show, heard a baby's pitiful wail. He halted, listened again to make sure, and on entering his reception parlor asked his favorite usher if he had not heard that odd thing there, an infant's cry. The attendant promptly related that a woman with a babe was without, who had been losing her time 3 days. "Go at once and send her to me," he ordered, expressing regret that she should have been overlooked. As there were several extenuating points in her plea, or the benign official leaned that way, he wrote his pardon and gave it to the woman, whose still plaintive smile shone through her tears of gratitude. "Take that, my poor woman, and it will bring you back your husband," he said, going so far as to direct her to what authority to apply for the action. In showing her forth, the old usher, who knew his employer's tender heart where children were concerned, whispered, "It was the baby that did it." Told by old Daniel, the good-natured Irish usher. End of section 225.
Section 226 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. It Rests Me to Save a Life. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. It rests me to save a life. Schuyler Colfax, then Speaker of the House, pleaded with Lincoln for the life of an elector's son, sentenced to be shot. Though he intruded on the arbiter very late, after a long spell of official duties, Lincoln accorded the boon. "Colfax," explained he, "it makes me rested after a hard day's work if I can find some good excuse for saving a man's life. And I go to bed happy as I think how joyous the signing of my name will make him and his family and his friends." End of section 226. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 227 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A family man wants to see his family. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. Superintendent Tinker, of the Western Union Telegraph Company, vouches for the following. A woman came to the Honorable Francis Kernan, member of Congress, with a pitiful tale, with which he went to the President. Her husband was a soldier who had been away from home a year. He deserted in order to have a glance at the family, and was captured on his way back to the front. But the rules of war are imperative and without compassion. The President was interested, as in all such cases where a deserving life and a sorrowing woman were at stake. He said, "Of course this man wanted to see his family. They ought not to shoot him for that." He telegraphed for action in the matter to cease, and finally pardoned the deserter. A fellow feeling, for all his thoughts reverted to his family life at Springfield. End of section 227. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 228 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A Rule Without Exception. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. Lincoln's Amnesty Proclamation, issued in December 1863, exemplifies the perpetual attempt to infuse mercy into the intestine warfare which always grows more fierce by oil thrown on the flames, and only once, in our case, terminated in the brothers becoming brothers again. He replied thus to a public criticizer of the document: "When a man is sincerely penitent for his misdeeds, and gives satisfactory evidence of the same, he can safely be pardoned, and there is no exception to the rule. End of section 228. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 4th, 2009.
Section 229 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Even Rebels Might Be Saved. Read for LibriVox.org. A Mr. Shrigley of Philadelphia, having been appointed hospital chaplain, the President sent in his name to the Senate, and his confirmation was imminent. A deputation came on to protest on the grounds that he was a Universalist, a large-minded man, who did not believe in endless punishment. Logically, he believed that even the rebels will be saved, concluded the opposition, horrified. Well, gentlemen, determined the President gravely, if that be so, and if there is any way under heaven whereby the rebels can be saved, then for God's sake and for their sakes, let the man be appointed. End of section 229. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 230 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Whipping Around the Stump. On New Year's morning, 1864, President Lincoln entered the War Department building. His sensitive nature, more than ever strained to the utmost tension, was irritated by hearing a woman wailing over a child in her arms at an office door. Major Eckert requested to ascertain the cause of the grief brought back the painful but not unexampled explanation. A soldier's wife had come to Washington with her babe, expecting to have no difficulty in going on under the pass to the camp where her husband was under the colors. But she learned, to her dismay, that, while an officer's wife has few obstacles to meet in communing with her husband under like circumstances, the private's is dissimilarly situated. This poor soul, with little money anyway, was perplexed how to wait in the expensive city till her wish was granted. "Come, Eckert," blurted out the chief in his frank manner, "let's send the woman down there." It was recited that the War Office had strengthened the orders against women in camp. Coughed the other in his dry way, ominous of an alternative. "Let us whip the devil around the stump, since he will not step right over. Send this woman's husband leave of absence to report here to see his wife and baby." So the officer on duty wrote the order, and the couple were happily reunited. By A. B. Chandler, Manager of Postal Telegraphs attached to the War Department in the war. End of section 230. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 231 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Life Too Precious to Be Lost. Read for LibriVox.org by Steve Eberhardt. Benjamin Owen, a young Vermont volunteer, was sentenced to the extremity for being asleep on post. Lincoln was especially lenient in these cases, as he held that a farm boy, used to going to bed early, was apt to maintain the habit in later life. It came out that the youth had taken the place of a comrade the night before as extra duty, and this overwork had fatigued him so that his succumbing was at least explicable. This clue being in a letter he wrote home, his sister journeyed to the Capitol with it and showed it to the President. "Oh, that fatal sleep!" he exclaimed. "Thousands of lives might have been lost through that fatal sleep." He wrote out the pardon and said to the girl, "Go home, my child, and tell that father of yours, who could approve of his country's sentence, even when it took the life of a youth like that Abraham Lincoln thinks the life too precious to be lost." He went in his carriage to deliver the pardon to the proper authorities for its execution, and not the soldiers. Then, making out a furlough for the released volunteer, he saw him and the sister off on the homeward journey, pinning a badge on the former's arm with the words, "The shoulder which should bear a comrade's burden, and die for it so uncomplainingly, must wear that strap." End of section 231. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 232 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Mercy has precedence over the rigid. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. Mercy has precedence over the rigid. On the 9th of April 1865, Lee accepted Grant's easy conditions, and practically everything was completed but the formal signing of the capitulation. The wide rejoicing covered the earth, the eyewitnesses may say, with one smile of relief and gladness. Washington looked gay with bunting, like New York City on the day of Show Your Flag. Above all, the President, whose words at Springfield in 1860 to the Illinois School Superintendent Newton Bateman were justified. I may not see the end, but it will come, and I shall be vindicated, in condemning slavery. It was, therefore, in a receptive mood that he was found by Senator J.B. Henderson of Missouri. This gentleman came for the third time on an errand of pity. At the close of the war, one Colonel Greene, brother to United States Senator James S. Greene, crossed into Mississippi with his friends and brother-in-arms, George E. Vaughan. He gave Vaughan letters for home and started him to carry news to his family. Captured within the Federal lines, he was held as a spy. Mr. Henderson succeeded in getting a retrial and even a third hearing, but still the man was under sentence of death. On the afternoon of April 14, he called at the White House and insisted that the pardon should be granted now, if ever, in the interest of peace and consideration. The gladsome chief agreed with him and directed him to go to Secretary Stanton and have the prisoner released. But the inflexible official, on whom the General Lee had no softening, refused, and the man had but 2 days to live. When the intermediary hurried back to the executive mansion, the President was dressed to go to Ford's Theatre with his wife, his son, and a young couple of friends. Nevertheless, he stopped, went into the study, and wrote an unconditional release and pardon for Vaughan, saying, "I think this will have precedence over Stanton." It was his last official act, one of mercy and forgiveness. End of section 232. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 233 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Taken from Rebellion and Given to Loyalty. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. A lady out of Tennessee, which was early to join secession, came to Washington in search of her son, a youth enlisted in the Confederate Army. She found him in the Fort Henry Hospital, where, allowed to see him as she was loyal, in spite of regulations about prisoners of war, she learned that he would recover. She induced him to recant and offer his parole if he were allowed freedom. She called on Secretary Stanton, but he was in one of his boorish moods. Was he ever out of them? And repulsed her with rudeness. She finally appealed to the President, who seemed very often balm to Stanton, a fretful corrosive applied to a deathly wound, and he gave her an order to receive the young man if he swore off his pledge to the wrong side. To take the young man from the ranks of the rebellion, he said to her, and give him to a loyal mother is a better investment to this government than to give him up to its deadly enemies. The young man was enabled to resume his studies, but in a northern college. End of section 233. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 234 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Suspension is not execution. Read for LibriVox.org. Among those generals, amateurs like the President themselves, who disapproved of any leniency in discipline, was Major General Benjamin F. Butler. He wrote to his commander-in-chief so impudent an epistle as the annexed, "Mr. President, I pray you not to interfere with the court-martial of this army." His skill was discoursed upon by General Grant, who said that Butler had corked himself up. "You will destroy all discipline among the soldiers." But in the teeth of this embargo, moved by the entreaties of an old father whose son was under death sentence by this despot, he said, "Butler or no Butler, here goes," and seizing his pen, wrote that the soldier in prison was not to be shot until further orders. The affected parent eagerly took the precious paper, but his jaw fell on seeing the text. He had looked for a full pardon, but the comforter hastened to explain, "Well, my friend, I see you are not very well acquainted with me. If your son never looks upon death till further orders from me to shoot him, he will live to be a great deal older than Methuselah. End of section 234. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 235 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Discontented About 400. In 1856 Mr. Lincoln had figured prominently in the Fremont-Dayton presidential campaign, and ever since he had been partial to the Pathfinder, though he clearly saw that he would be a rival for the chair at Washington, his long-cherished ambition. He gave, at the outset of the war, the most important military command, that of the Mountain, or Western Department, to Fremont. The latter attempted to "steal his thunder" by issuing a forerunner of the Emancipation Act, and was removed; but Lincoln reinstated him till he had to repeat the removal. He was repaid by the incorrigible Marplot setting up as candidate for the chief magistracy after it was settled that the retiring officer should be re-elected. Nevertheless, the competitor's party was so small that, in allusion to it, Lincoln read from Samuel, Book 1. And every one who was in distress, and every one that was in debt, and every one who was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. End of section 235. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 236 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Not much of a head, but his only one. Read for LibriVox.org. Although the life of a soldier sleeping on post was at stake, the pleader wished to forbear on finding that the supreme decider, the President, meant to make a personal matter of it. He suspended the execution while looking into it, but it was objected that this was a burden not intended to impose. "Never mind," Lincoln answered. "This soldier's life is as valuable to him as any person's in the land. It reminds me of the old Scotchwoman's saying about her lard going to be beheaded for participation in a Jacobite rebellion. It war na mickle of a head, but it is the only head the puir body ha' got." Assured in substance by L. E. Chittenden. End of section 236. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 237 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Gi' us a good conceit. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. A place hunter hastened to his old acquaintance, Lincoln, when he was seated, of course to secure a trough. But he aimed high, in contrast to Lincoln's adage that a novice should aim low. The least he named was the berth of Master of the Mint. "Good gracious!" ejaculated the chief. "Why did he not ask to be the Secretary of Treasury and have done with it?" Reflecting, he observed, "Well now, I never thought that Link had anything more than average ability when we were youngsters together. But then I suppose he thought the same thing about me, and yet here I am." End of section 237. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 4th, 2009.
Section 238 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. They Went Away Sicker Still. Read for LibriVox.org. A party were pressing the claims of a solicitor for a consulship, his particular plea that his health would be benefited by residence on these fortunate islands. The Lord Bountiful terminated the interview by lightly saying, "Gentlemen, I am sorry to say that there are 8 other applicants for the place, and all of them are sicker than your client." End of section 238. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 239 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Of 20 applicants. Read for LibriVox.org by Morgan Downtrick. Of 20 applicants, 19 are made enemies. Hampered, harassed, and hounded by office seekers, the President once opened his confidence on this irritating point to a conscientious public officer. He wished the senators and others would start and stimulate public sentiment towards change in public offices being made on good and sufficient cause, that is, plainly, never on party considerations. The ideal civil service, in a word. 9/10 of his vexations were due to seekers of sinecures. It seems to me that such visitors dart at me with finger and thumb, carry off a portion of my vitality, he was saying. His hearer laughed at the image, but the other pursued earnestly. I have made up my mind to make very few changes in office in my gift from a second term. I think now that I shall not move a single man except for delinquency. To remove a man is very easy, but when I go to fill his place there are 20 applicants, and of those I must make 19 enemies. Authenticated by Senator Clark of New Hampshire, to whom this confidence was imparted. Footnote. Secretary Blaine, out of his similar experience, reiterated the sentiment thus: When I choose, out of 10 applicants to fill an office, I find that 9 have become enemies, and 1 is an ingrate. End of section 239. This recording is in a public domain.
Section 240 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Rid of an Office Seeker. There was an ignorant man, said a senator, who once applied to Lincoln for the post of doorkeeper to the house. This man had no right to ask Lincoln for anything. It was necessary to repulse him. But Lincoln repulsed him gently and whimsically, without hurting his feelings, in this way: "So you want to be doorkeeper to the house, eh?" "Yes, Mr. President." "Well, have you ever been a doorkeeper? Have you ever had any experience of doorkeeping?" "Well, no actual experience, sir." "Any theoretical experience? Any instructions in the duties and ethics of doorkeeping?" No." "Have you ever attended lectures on doorkeeping?" "No, sir." "Have you ever read any textbook on the subject?" "No." "Have you conversed with any one who has read such a book?" "No, sir, I'm afraid not, sir." "Well, then, my friend, don't you see that you haven't a single qualification for this important post?" said Lincoln in a reproachful tone. "Yes, I do," said the applicant, and he took leave humbly, almost gratefully. Chicago Record Herald. End of section 240. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 241 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Not good offices, but a good story. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. When Washington and its chief guardians were more sorely besieged by office seekers than by the Confederates, a politician locally important and generally opportunate was sent as a committee of one to headquarters to secure the loaves and fishes for his congeries. But in about a fortnight, this forager came home full of emptiness. Asked if he had not seen the president, accounted commonly as only too accessible, and why he did not get the places, he replied glumly, yet with a tinge of brightening. "Yes, I saw the old man. He heard me state my errand. The president did. He heard me patiently all right enough, and then he said, 'I am sorry not to have any good offices for you, but I can give you something, a good story.' And he went on with, 'Once there was a certain king who kept an astrologer to forewarn him of coming events, and especially to tell him whether it was going to rain when he wished to go on hunting expeditions. One day he had started for the forest with his train of lords and ladies when he met a farmer. 'Good morning, farmer,' said the king. 'Good morning, king,' said the farmer. 'Where are you folks going?' 'Hunting,' said the king. 'Hunting? You'll all get wet,' said the farmer. The king trusted his astrologer and kept on, but at midday there came up a tremendous rain that drenched the king and all his party. On getting back to the palace, the king had the astrologer decapitated and sent for the farmer to take his place. 'Law's sake,' said the farmer when he arrived, 'it ain't me that knows when it's going to rain. It's my donkey. When it's going to be fair weather, he always carries his ears forward, so. When it's going to rain, he puts 'em backward, so.' 'Make the donkey the court astrologer,' shouted the king. It was done, but the king always declared that that appointment was the greatest mistake he'd ever made in his life. Mr. Lincoln stopped there, said the office seeker. "Why did he call it a mistake?" we asked him. "Didn't the donkey do his duty?" "Yes," said the president, "but after that every donkey in the country wanted an office." End of section 241. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 4th, 2009.
Section 242 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Encourage Longing for Work. Read for LibriVox.org. In 1861, the badgered president had so novel an application that he wrote the annexed note to facilitate its harvest. To Major Ramsey. The lady, bearer of this, says she has 2 sons who want to work. Set them at it if possible. Wanting to work is so rare a merit that it should be encouraged. End of section 242. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 243 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. But Aaron got his commission. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. But Aaron got his commission. To animadversion on the president appointing to a post one who had zealously opposed his re-election, he replied, "Well, I allow that Judge E, having been disappointed before, did behave pretty ugly, but that would not make him any less fit for the place. And I think I have scriptural authority for appointing him. You remember when the Lord was on Mount Sinai getting out a commission for Aaron? Said Aaron was at the foot of the mountain making a false god for the people to worship. Yet Aaron got his commission, you know." End of section 243. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 244 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Something Lincolnian All Could Take. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. When the president had an attack of spotted fever and was told he must be immured as it was catching, he smiled and said, "It is a pity to shut the public off, as while every act of mine is not taken to, now I have something everybody might take." End of section 244. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 4th, 2009.
Section 245 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Not Many Such Boys Outside of Sunday Schools. A Boston business house was deceived in an errand boy. Fresh from the country, he succumbed to temptation and robbed the mails. His father tried to get him off the penalty, as the United States government took up the case. He went to Washington and prevailed on his representative, Alexander H. Rice, to intercede for him. Rice and the president were on familiar terms. As soon as the pleader presented himself, Mr. Lincoln assumed an easy attitude, legs stretched, leaning back, and read the petition. "Well," said he, "did you meet a man going out as you came in? His errand was to get a man out of the penitentiary, and now you come to get a boy out of jail. I am bothered to death about these pardon cases, but I am a little encouraged by your visit. They are after me on the men, but appear to be roping you in on the boys. What shall we do? The trouble appears to come from the courts. Let us abolish the courts, and I think that will end the difficulty. And it seems to me that the courts ought to be abolished anyway, for they appear to pick out the very best men in the community and send them to the penitentiary, and now they are after the same kind of boys. I don't know much about boys in Massachusetts, but according to this petition, there are not many such boys as this one outside the Sunday schools in other parts." It was settled that if a majority of the Massachusetts delegates signed the paper, a pardon would be given. Testified to by Hon. Alexander H. Rice, former governor of Massachusetts. End of section 245. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 246 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Good Boy Gets On. Read for LibriVox.org by Jerusha Renstrom. The Good Boy Gets On. According to White House etiquette, As a congressman and a senator, Wilson and Rice, called together on the president, they were admitted in company. As they were readmitted from the anteroom, a boy of about 12 on the lookout slipped in with them. After the salutations, the host became absorbed in the intruder, as he was always interested in the young. But the two gentlemen were unable to answer the natural question, "Who is this little boy?" But the boy could speak for himself, and instantly said that he was a good boy, come to Washington in the hope of becoming a page in the House of Representatives. The president began to say that Captain Goodnow, head doorkeeper there, was the proper person to make that application to, as he had nothing to do with such appointments. But the good little boy pulled out his credentials from his folks, the squire, and the parson and schoolmaster, and they stated not only that he was good, but good to his widow mother, and wanted to help the needy family. The president called the boy up to him, studied him, and wrote on his petition, "If Captain Goodnow can give this good boy a place, it will oblige A. Lincoln." Vouched for by Alexander H. Rice, Member of Congress, and ex-governor of Massachusetts. End of section 246. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 247 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. How McCullough Was Constrained to Serve. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. For 2 arduous years, Hugh McCullough, banker of Indianapolis, served in organizing the currency control. He was looking forward to release and repose at the second administration when the renewed incumbent begged him to become Secretary of the Treasury. He remonstrated. "But I could not help myself," he confessed to Janet Jennings. Mr. Lincoln looked at me with his sad, weary eyes, and throwing his arm over my shoulder, said, "You must. The country needs you." That was a gesture worth all the elegant tones in the elocution books. End of section 247. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 4th, 2009.
Section 248 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. All Mouth and No Hands Class. Read for LibriVox.org. I hold if the Almighty had ever made a set of men that should do all the eating and none of the work, he would have made them with mouths only and no hands, and if he had ever made another class that he had intended should do all the work and none of the eating, he would have made them without mouths and with all hands. End of section 248. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 249 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Hot and Cold the Same Breath. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. Underlaying the innate frankness, there was a deep shrewdness in President Lincoln, which fitted him to cope with the most expert politicians, albeit their vanity would not let them always or promptly acknowledge it. When Chief Justice Taney died, the President had already planned to fill up the vacancy and at the same time shelve that thorn in his side, Salmon P. Chase. But always keeping his own counsel, he was mute on that head, when an important deputation attended to recommend Chase. After hearing the address, the President asked for the engrossed memorial to be left with him. "I want it, in order, if I appoint Mr. Chase, I may show the friends of the other persons for whom the office is solicited, by how powerful an influence and what strong recommendations I was obliged to disregard in appointing him." This was heard with great satisfaction, and the committee were about to depart, thinking their man sure of the mark, when they perceived that the chief had not finished all he had to say. "And," he continued, "I want the paper also, in order that, if I should appoint any other person, I may show his friends how powerful an influence and what strong recommendations I was obliged to disregard in appointing him." The committee departed mystified. End of section 249. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 250 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Wanted the Jail Earnings. A Western senator bothered the President about a client of his for back pay of a dubious nature. Lincoln responded with one of his evasive answers, that is, a little story. Years ago, when imprisonment for debt was legal, a poor fellow was sent to jail by his creditor, and compelled to serve out his debt at a rate of $1.50 a day. When the sentence had expired, he informed the jailer of the fact, and asked to be released. The jailer insisted on keeping him 4 days longer. Upon making up his statement, however, he found that the man was right. The prisoner then demanded not only a receipt in full for his debt, but also payment for 4 days' extra service, amounting to $6, which he declared the county owed him. "Now," continued Lincoln, "I think that county would be about as likely to pay this man's claim as this government will be to pay your friend's claim for back pay." Told before Colonel Noteware of Colorado, a Western senator and a congressman. End of section 250. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 251 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A title, no hindrance. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. A German noble and military officer wished to serve as volunteer under our colors. After being welcome, he thought it expedient to unfold his family role, so to say, but the ultra-democratic ruler gently interpolated as if he saw an apology in the recital, and soothingly observed, "Oh, never mind that. You will find that no hindrance to your advance. You will be treated as fairly in spite of that." End of section 251. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 252 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A Talker with Nothing to Say. Read for LibriVox.org. A reverend gentleman of prominence, Mr. F. was presented to the President, who resignedly had a chair placed for him, and with patient awaiting said, "My dear sir, I am now ready to hear what you have to say." "Why, bless you, Mr. President," stammered the other, with more apprehension than his host, "I have nothing to say. I only came to pay my respects." "Is that all?" exclaimed the escaped victim, springing up to take the minister's hands with gladness. "It is a relief to find a clergyman, or any other man for that matter, who has nothing to say. I thought you had come to preach to me." Footnote: Any other man. From this frequent expression of Mr. Lincoln's, a true comedian, the Negro entertainer, Unsworth, conceived a burlesque lecture, or any other man, with which he went around the world. The editor, passing through London, remembers his attention being called to Mr. Gladstone and other cabinet ministers, who came to the Oxford Music Hall nightly between Parliament business to hear Unsworth, who on such chances introduced personal and pat allusions to the subjects debated that night. End of section 252. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 253 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Stick to your business. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. Stick to your business. Among the Boers who assailed the President was a Western stranger who had another plan to end the war. Lincoln listened to him all the way, and then obliged him and the crowd with a story. You may have heard of Mr. Bounce of Chicago. No? Well, he was a gentleman of so much leisure that he had no time to do anything. This superb loafer went to a capitalist at the time of a wheat flurry, when speculators reckoned to make fortunes, and he informed Mr. Blankcheck how his project would make them both terribly rich. The reply came sharp as a bear trap. "My advice is that you stick to your business." "But I have no business. I'm a gentleman." "Whatever that is, I advise you to stick to that." "And now, my friend," proceeded the President, "I mean nothing offensive, for I know you mean well, but I think you had better stick to your business, and leave the war threshing to those who have the responsibility." End of section 253. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 254 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Marrying a Man Without His Consent. Read for LibriVox.org. Major Hopsley, Excelsior, New York Brigade, wounded in the fighting, Joe Hooker Division, could not accept a commission in the Army, but wished to be put upon the staff of the Volunteers, as he could not walk. He was upheld in his desire by Adjutant General Hamlin, who accompanied him to the President. They were both asked to sit while the authority consulted the congressional laws. Staff appointments could not be heard by the President unless the general commanding the desired rank was approving. "I have no more power to appoint you without that request," said the President, "than I would have to marry a woman to any man she might desire for a husband without his consent." By General Charles Hamlin. End of section 254. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 255 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A luxury to see one who wants nothing. Senator Depew was Secretary of New York State in 1864 under Governor Seymour. He had to wait upon President Lincoln, re-elected, to harmonize the calls for men, as his state was split on the accusation that the draft favored one party above the other. His official business finished, Secretary Depew called to bid farewell. Lincoln was not holding a reception, but sitting in that study accessible to the public that never was a public man's sanctum before or after. He was intruded upon all the time, as he let the door remain wide open. Old New Yorkers may recall P.T. Barnum, the showman's, similar habit. Every now and then some petitioners would make a desperate rush in and, on seeing they were not repelled by order or by the usher's own initiative, others would be emboldened to do the same. The New Yorker no sooner took his cue than the besieged man perceived him. "Hello, Depew, what do you want?" was his hail. "Nothing, Mr. President, save to pay my respects to you as I am going home." "Stay! It is such a luxury to see any one who does not want anything." He had the room cleared, and discussed the war, interspersing the dialogue with opposite stories. Told by Senator C.M. Depew. End of section 255. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 256 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Accuse not a servant. Read for LibriVox.org by Hannah Dowell. As the possibilities of rapid advancement were redoubled during the war, the President, in his first term of office, was stormed by the office-seekers, who thought it the best plan to have occupiers of posts outed to give them an opening. So they maligned and even accused chief officials with a freedom unknown in other countries where the bureaucracy is a sacred institution, as, within a generation, it has become here. Lincoln rebuked one of those covetous vexers by saying gravely to him, "Friend, go home, and attentively read Proverbs, chapter 13, verse 10. The rebuffed applicant found at that page in the book, "Accuse not a servant to his master, lest he curse thee, and thou be found guilty." Attested by Schuyler Colfax. End of section 256. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 257 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A wolf in a trap must sacrifice his tail to be free. Read for LibriVox.org by Captain Allegra. The presidential private secretary, Stoddard, maintains that his chief sorely astonished and baffled the tribe of acquaintances who flocked in upon him as soon as he was elevated, and went back home with empty haversacks, wondering that he ignored them with heartless ingratitude. He did not make even his own father a brigadier, nor invite cousin Dennis Hanks to a seat in his cabinet. End of section 257. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 258 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Somewhat of a Newsman. Read for LibriVox.org by Todd Lennon. Innately attached to letters and precocious, Abraham Lincoln soon learned his letters and drank in all the learning that his few books could supply. Hence, at an early age, he became the oracle on the rude frontier, where even a smattering made him handy and valuable to the illiterate backwoodsman. Besides, as working at any place and at any work, he rarely abided long in any one spot, and had not what might be called a home in his teens. Dennis Hanks, his cousin, said of Abraham, at 14 to 18, "Abe was a good talker, a good reader, and a kind of newsboy. Hence he was a sort of volunteer colporteur, distributing gossip, as a notion peddler, before he was a store clerk where centered all the local news. It was on this experience that he would mingle with the newspaper reporters and telegraph men fraternally, saying with his winning smile and undeniable push, 'Let me in, boys, for I am somewhat of a news-gatherer myself.' And then he would fix his footing by one of his stories, always, well often, uttered with a view to publication." End of section 258. This recording is in the public domain, recorded by Todd Lennon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, January 4th, 2009.
Section 259 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A little more light and a little less noise. Read for LibriVox.org. As the President was a diligent devourer of the newspaper in the vexatious times, as at all others, he met many a torrent of criticism, incitement, and counsels, which left him stunned rather than alleviated. To a special correspondent who hampered him, he said, "Your papers remind me of a little story. There was a gentleman traveling on horseback in the West, where the roads were few and bad and no settlements. He lost his way. To make matters worse, as night came on, a terrible thunderstorm arose. Lightning dazzled the eye, or thunder shook the earth. Frightened, he got off and led his horse, seeking to guide himself by the spasmodic and flickering electric light. All of a sudden, a tremendous crash brought the man in terror to his knees, when he stammered, 'O Lord, if it be the same to thee, give us a little more light and a little less noise.'" End of section 259. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 260 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. My part of the ship is anchored. Among the first men called out was a young Massachusetts man, Burridge, who went as a private. Grievously wounded, he was sent into the hospital and then to his home. Recuperated, he joined his old regiment at the front. He was unaware that strict orders were out against the soldiers exchanging newspapers, and so performed the daily courtesy of giving a paper to the rebels. They had two, and he promised to give them the one due next time. This was held as keeping up correspondence with the Johnnies, and the authorities reduced him to the ranks, as he was then a captain. Worse and worse, the enemy seized him when he went out to redeem his promise about the news, and he was imprisoned on their side. This regalled his wounds, and he was a great sufferer. The Massachusetts member of Congress, Alexander Rice, pleaded with the President for his native citizen. The complication was that Burridge was a captain when captured, but a private again soon after, and the rebels would probably hold him at the higher rate if an exchange was allowed, while the Union War Department stood for his being but a common soldier. "If General Wadsworth raises that point," replied the President, who had allowed this pathetic case to break his rule to deal with classes and not individual offenses, "tell him if he could take care of the exchange part, I guess I can take care of the rank part." It is clear that the President saw in this punctilio about a humane act whose offense was rancor. It reminded one of the story of the New England skipper who, with his mate and crew of a small fisher, owned the vessel. They having quarreled, and the captain bidding the other mind his part of the ship, the latter did so, and presently came to the stern to report, "Captain, I have anchored my part of the ship. Take care of your own." End of section 260. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 261, of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Angels Swearing Make No Difference. Read for LibriVox.org by Rick Rodstrom. On the President being urged to answer some virulent newspaper assault, his reply was, "Oh no, if I were to try to read, much less answer, all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, what is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference." End of section 261. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 262 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Washington's Difficult Task. Read for LibriVox.org. Shortly after Lincoln's inauguration, a senator said to him, "You have as difficult a task as Washington's, when he took command of the American army, and as little to do with it." "That is true, but I have larger resources." The 3,000 millions spent on the war vividly contrasts with the colonies fighting rich England with an empty treasury and barefoot, ragged soldiers. End of section 262. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 263 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Steal and Steal. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. President Lincoln asked a friend, a senator, immediately on his taking office, upon an embarrassed condition of affairs, "Have you seen that prophecy about my administration in the papers? A prophet foretells that my rule will be one of steel." To which the wags retort, "Well, Buchanan's was one of steel." The Georgian slaveholder, late Secretary of the Treasury, was accused of diverting some millions to the South, as that for the War Office similarly diverted ordnance and munitions to the same quarter. The head of the Navy, with what looked like collusion, had scattered the war vessels so as to be long delayed in concentrating. End of section 263. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 264 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. That's What's the Matter. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. That's What's the Matter. In a spiritualist performance at the White House, which seemed to have been edited by the President himself, as often royalty revises plays, for his special entertainment, the cabinet being invited, after a rigmarole of stilted phrases purporting to be by Washington, Franklin, Napoleon, and other past celebrities, Mr. Wells, Secretary of the Navy, remarked, "I will think this matter over and see what conclusion to arrive at." This was his set phrase. There was a smile at this, as the aged minister's prolonged meditations were the laughing-stock of the country, he being the clog on the wheels of the car of state. Instantly raps were heard in the spirit cabinet, and the alphabet being consulted, the result was spelled out as, "That's what's the matter." This hit at Mr. Wells' stereotyped fault aroused more mirth, and the crowd at the back of the room, domestics, petty officials, and sub-officers, laughed prodigiously, while the secretary stroked his long white beard musingly. To this cant term hangs a tale apropos of the President. Its origin was low, but humorous. A benevolent gentleman pierced a crowd to its centre to see there, on the pavement under a lamp-post, a poor woman curled in a heap, with a satisfied grin on her flushed face, breathing brokenly. "What's the matter?" eagerly inquired the compassionate man. A bystander removed his pipe from his mouth, and with it pointed to a flattened pocket flask sticking out of her smashed reticule, half under her, and sententiously explained, "That's what's the matter with Hannah." The sentence took growth and spread all over the Union. It has settled down, as we know, to a fixed form at political meetings, where the audience beguile the waiting time with demanding, "What is the matter?" with this or that favourite demagogue. In the 60s it patly answered any problem. At the presidential election time of Lincoln's success, a Negro minstrel, Unsworth, was the star at 444 Broadway, dressing up the Daily News trolley under his title, that is, ending each paragraph with that line. On the 22nd of February 1861, Abraham Lincoln, scheduled to pass on from Harrisburg, where he had made a speech as arranged, instead of waiting to depart by the morning train, sped to Philadelphia, and thence by a special train, detained for a military messenger with a parcel, to Washington by the regular midnight train. The news of his arrival at the capital by this unexpected and clandestine route, and in disguise this was denied, of a Scotch cap and plaid shawl, startled everybody. Rumours of an attempt to make mischief, as he called it, were rife, but the public still took things as quake-proof, and Mr. Lincoln assured his audiences, as he spoke at every city on his way, that the crisis was artificial. On the evening of the 23rd, the writer dropped into the Broadway Negro Minstrel Hall. Newspaper men knew that Unsworth introduced the latest skimming off the press into his burlesque lecture, and liked to hear his funny versions and perversions. The comic sheet of the Metropolis, Vanity Fair, enframing the witty scintillations of Artemus Ward, George Arnold, and a brilliant band, complained that this nigger comedian used or anticipated their best effusions. On the whole, the public saw in the surreptitious flight of the ruler into his due seat only a farce, in keeping with his jesting humour. He was regarded as Don Quixote in figure, but a Sancho Panza for his philosophical proverbs, widely retailed and considered opportune. So the indignation proper toward the forced escapade was absent. Everybody still mocked at the terrible plots, as so much stale quail. And when the blackened-faced orator, coming to a pause after enunciation of his "That's what's the matter," looked around wistfully, the audience were agog. Suddenly, out of the wing, an attendant darted with an alarmed manner and face. He carried on his arm a shawl, grey and travel-stained, and in one shaking hand a Scotch bonnet. Unsworth snatched them in hot haste and fright, clapped on the cap, and, draping himself in the plaid, rushed off at the side, forgetting his own high silk hat. This was the black suit. The orthodox lecturers now gave him a resemblance to Mr. Lincoln, not previously perceived, for they were men of opposite shapes. The eclipse brought home to the spectators the ludicrousness of the President entering his capital in secret. But, I repeat, no one felt any shame, and the audience went forth to relate the excellent finish to the parody, at home or in the saloons, to hearers as obtuse as themselves, to the seriousness of the episode. Somehow, so far, the elect from Illinois was ever the Western buffoon. But when, in his inaugural address, Lincoln thundered the new keynote, the veil fell. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, is the momentous issue of the Civil War. War? The crisis was no longer artificial. He admitted that. What impended? What had fallen? Jest and earnest were still coupled, but earnest took the lead from that hour. So the Chief Magistrate in his first official speech, "Physically speaking, we cannot separate. That's what's the matter." End of section 264. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 265 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Ship of State Simile. On the morning of Lincoln's arrival in Washington, General Logan and Mr. Lovejoy called on him at Willard's Hotel to urge a firm and vigorous policy. He replied, "As the country has placed me at the helm of the ship, I'll try to steer her through." The Sangamon River pilot spoke there. "I understand the ship to be made for the carrying and preservation of the cargo, and so long as the ship can be saved with the cargo it should never be abandoned, unless it fails in the probability of its preservation, and shall cease to exist, except at the risk of throwing overboard both freight and passengers." Speech, New York Reception, 1861. "I trust that I may have the assistance of the members of this legislature in piloting the ship of state through this voyage, surrounded by perils as it is, For if it should suffer shipwreck now, there will be no pilot ever needed for another voyage. Speech, Trenton, New Jersey, 1861. End of section 265. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 266 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A Pill for the Public Printer. Read for LibriVox.org. In Lincoln's first message to Congress, special session, July 4, 1861, is seen this passage: "With rebellion thus sugar-coated, they have been drugging the public mind," etc. Mr. DeFreeze, public printer, with the proofreader's sublime spurning of plain speech, objected to this sweet word, and said, "Mr. President, you are using an undignified expression. I would alter the construction if I were you." "DeFreeze," was the crushing reply, "that word expresses precisely my idea, and I am not going to change it. The time will never come in this country when the people won't know exactly what sugar-coated means." "I jinks, I can beat you both." One day the public printer wanted to correct a Lincolnism in one of the presidential documents. "Go home, DeFreeze, and see if you can better it." The next day DeFreeze took him his amendment. It happened that Secretary Seward had spied the same fault as the printer, and Lincoln confronted the two improvements. "I jinks, by jingo, Seward has been rewriting the same paragraph. I believe that you have beat Seward, but I think I can beat you both." And he wrote, with his firm hand, "Stet, so let it stand," on the proof sheet. End of section 266. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 267 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Let the Grass Grow Where It May. Read for LibriVox.org by Kidder. Up to the dread day when the news of the flag of our Union being fired upon in Charleston Harbor, the country resembled the sea in one of those calms preceding a storm, when the placidity betrays hidden in mighty currents, and overhead in the clear sky one divines the coursers of the tempest gathering to race and strife like that beneath. Up to Lincoln's arrival in Washington, the nest of sedition, the pro-slavery peace-at-any-price party slackened in no efforts to retain the status quo. Or worse, a new state of the southern states branching off as suckers strike from the main stem. William E. Dodge had the courage to face the wrought-up chief magistrate, chafed with his narrow escape from the assassins of the railroad journey from Baltimore. Said Mr. Dodge, "It is for you, Mr. President, to say whether the whole nation shall be plunged into bankruptcy. The slaves were valued as property at $2,000 million. Whether the grass shall grow in the streets of our commercial cities. The balance of trade against the South to the manufacturing and supplying North was stupendous." "Then I say it shall not," replied Lincoln. "If it depends on me, the grass will not grow anywhere, save in the fields and meadows." Mr. Dodge persisted in his sordid and businesslike errand. "Then you will not go to war on account of slavery?" "I do not know what my acts may be in the future, beyond this. The Constitution will not be preserved and defended until it is enforced and obeyed in every part of every one of the United States. It must be so respected, obeyed, enforced, and defended, let the grass grow where it will." End of section 267. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 268 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Peace at Any Price Party. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. The Peace at Any Price Party. If there were a class of men who, having no choice of sides in the contest, were anxious to have only quiet and comfort for themselves while it rages, and to fall in with the victorious side at the end of it, without loss to themselves, their advice as to the mode of conducting the contest would be precisely such as his being Mr. Thomas Durant, who in 1862 wrote a letter on behalf of the Conservatives asking to be let alone. He speaks of no duty, apparently thinks of none, resting upon Union men. He even thinks it injurious to the Union cause that they should be restrained in trade and passage without taking sides. They are to touch neither a sail nor a pump, live merely as passengers, deadheads at that, to be carried snug and dry through the storm, and safely landed right side up. Nay, more, even a mutineer is to go untouched lest these sacred passengers receive an accidental wound. The letter was to Sea Bullet, July 28, 1862. End of section 268. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 269 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Things were topsy-turvy aloft, too. Read for LibriVox.org. One evening, when Mr. Hall, astronomer, was working in the Naval Observatory, Washington, on the great equatorial telescope, he was startled to have his sanctum invaded by the gaunt, extenuated figure of the President. He was made welcome, of course, and the varied mechanism explained to him. As the crowning treat, he was given a peer through the celebrated instrument. It was levelled at the moon, or rather arranged to have that orb in its focus at the time. The visitor was appalled, as well as wondering at the view, and slowly withdrew by the trap-door. But when the astronomer resumed his observations and calculations he was interrupted by the same sedate and absorbed caller. He returned, perplexed, as on glancing up at the moon with the unhindered vision, he saw it in another position to that presented in the spyglass. Mr. Hall made it clear to him, as the telescope was pointed, not at the satellite, but at its image in a mirror, he saw its reflection, and consequently the reverse of the face we observe. The President went away with the satisfaction of a man wanting every novelty demonstrated. End of section 269. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 270 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Hitching to the Moon. Lincoln came to Washington to view the situation, and found the world all upside down, a rumpus in the nation. Topical Song, 1860. End of section 270. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 271 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A Red Flag to Him. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. A Red Flag to Him. A most remarkable prelude to the war was the performance through the northern states of the Chicago Zouaves. The name came from the irregular regiment in the French Algerian service, composed of men worthy of being drummed out of the regular corps. They dressed like the Arabs in the small bolero jacket and baggy red trousers familiar since. They drilled gymnastically, not to say theatrically. Ellsworth, a clerk in the Lincoln and Herndon law office, had a martial turn, and hearing daily in that quasi-political vortex of the impending crisis, determined to be forearmed in case of the differences coming to blows. He raised, uniformed, a la Zuzu, a score of young men like himself, and proceeded to give exhibitions at home and then in the East. The writer retains a vivid memory of the odd and fantastic show, which, however, was regarded as not war, though magnificent. But Captain Ellsworth was in earnest. Mustered in with his company, he started the Zouave movement, which led to 2 or more regiments being formed. His being the first volunteers at the fore, he claimed the right of the reconnoitring force sent out in May against Alexandria to break up railroads held by the rebels. Seeing a rebel flag on a hotel top, he entered the building and was shot by the landlord in coming down from cutting it away. He was slain instantly, and the like fate befell the murderer, the host, from Ellsworth's guard. Apart from 4 men killed at Sumter and 2 in Baltimore riots, the Chicago Zouave was the first victim of the rebellion. But the position was regained by the secessionists, and the rebel flag replaced the removed one, to the grief of President Lincoln. He could see it from his resident, and Murat Halstead, without knowing the melancholy association of the young officer, being a familiar in his office, reports seeing him dwell with spyglass bent on the flag for hours. Elmer Ellsworth, in his last speech made to the men he was leading out to the front, proves that he imbibed Lincoln's humanity with legal precepts in the office. Show the enemy that I want to kill them with kindness. End of section 271. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 272 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Fly Away Jack. Read for LibriVox.org by Tricia G. Fly Away Jack. At the end of 1860, South Carolina took the lead in seceding, and in the opening of the next year 6 other Southern states allied themselves with her. The timid feared hasty acting would precipitate the marshalling of the waverers under the same flag. To a committee urging a pause to see "how the cats would jump," the President observed: "If there be 3 pigeons on the fence, and you fire and kill one, how many will there be left?" The voices said, 2. "Oh, no," he corrected, "there would be none left, for the other 2, frightened by the shot, would have flown away." As a truth, the firing on Fort Sumter welded the seceders into their Union, at the same time as it likewise fused the Northerners into consistency. The President said to General Veal, "We want to keep all that we have of the border states, those that have not seceded, and the portions we have occupied." End of section 272. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 273 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. His pen wanted to keep their hogs safe. Read for LibriVox.org. Just after the call for 75,000 90-day men to subdue the outbreak after Sumter was cannonaded, a deputation of loyal Virginians waited upon the President. They expounded on this levy that the fair fields of the South would be overrun by the ragamuffins of the northern cities, and the hen roosts and pig houses ravished. "But what would you have me do?" asked Lincoln, who did not then foresee his having to conduct the military movements. "Mr. President, if you would only lend us your pen a moment," meaning, of course, that he should write a line to calm the rising storm. But the other pretended to misunderstand him, saying, "Lend my pen? My pen? What would you do with that? Keep your hogs safe with that?" End of section 273. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 274 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Hurrah for You. Read for LibriVox.org by Andrew Hoots. At the Chicago reception a little boy came into the room with his father. No doubt he had been instructed to behave with decorum in the august presence, but he no sooner saw the tall, prominent figure than he shouted, "Hurrah for Miss Lincoln!" The crowd laughed, and still the more as the object of the ovation caught up the little fellow, gave him a toss to the ceiling, and while he was in the air shouted out lustily, "Hurrah for Mr. U!" and catching him, lowered him red and panting to the floor. End of section 274. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 275 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Put your feet right and stand firm. Giving a lift in his carriage to 2 ladies to the Soldiers' Home, the horses were splashing and sliding after a shower in the mire, when Mr. Lincoln assisted the frightened women to alight. He set 3 stones for stepping stones in the mud, and assisted them to firm ground. He had cautioned them in making the passage. All through life be sure to put your feet in the right place, and then stand firm. Looking down on his muddy boots, Lincoln as a Westerner always stuck to leg boots and was never seen in the effeminate "Congress gaiters," by the by, he added, "I have always heard of Washington mud, and now I shall take some home as a sample." End of section 275. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 276 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Get their graves ready. Read for LibriVox.org. In April 1861, a deputation of sympathizers with secession had the boldness to call on President Lincoln and demand a cessation of hostilities until convening of Congress, threatening that 75,000 Marylanders would contest the passage of troops over their soil. "I presume," quietly replied Mr. Lincoln, "that there is room enough in her soil for 75,000 graves?" Peterson's Life of Lincoln. End of section 276. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 277 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Mr. Lincoln's Opinion of General McClellan. Read for LibriVox.org by Steve Eberhardt. In the first stage of the war, when the President was Commander-in-Chief of the forces by virtue of his office, he played the part of the elevated boy in The King of the Castle. Every one of his colleagues, who ought to have been his loyal supporters, until some firm stand was attained under the batteries of Richmond, civil and military, warred against him, underhandedly and haply openly. All aimed, in cabinet and on the staff, to be ruler. The understrappers of aged General Scott upheld all that concurred with warfare, set and obsolete, of the European strategists, overthrown by the great Napoleon. The principal practicer of these tactics, the summum bonum, or good thing, of the West Pointers, was General McClellan, the little Mac of his worshippers, and the little Napoleon of the dazzled crowd. He was, like Cassio, a great arithmetician, who had never set a squadron in the field, or the division of a battle new, etc., seeming utterly to ignore that the enemy was composed of men trained by their life in genteel occupations to shoot true, to ride like Comanches, or revolutionary Harry Lee's light horse, used to lying outdoors under skies genial to them, and subsisting on game and corn cake, as Marion on sweet potatoes. He expected to foil such guerrillas as Jeb Stuart, Mosby, and Quantrell by earthworks, which they probably would have leaped their horse over if they wanted to reach their spoil in that way. It was in allusion to this adherence to Vauban that the President, who eyed the aspiring Hotspur as Henry V, his heir, the sixth Henry, trying on his crown, observed shrewdly when the general kept silence, "He is entrenching." End of section 277. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 278 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. A Stationary Engine. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. A Stationary Engine. Lincoln said of the much promising General McClellan, "He is an admirable engineer, but he seems to have a special talent for a stationary engine." He also cited him as a scholar and a gentleman. Nevertheless, as the education lavished on the Army of the Potomac to make it earn foreign military critics' praise at reviews was not thrown away, but made sound soldiers which in time were invaluable to General Grant. Lincoln did him justice by quaintly but earnestly saying, "I would like to borrow his arm if he has no further use for it." General Franklin heard this, but Little Mac had no design on the dictatorship, being surely a lover of the Union too. End of section 278. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 279 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Shoveling Fleas. Read for LibriVox.org. On account of the looseness and corruption attending the raising of soldiers at the first, the President, noting the difference between the number of men forwarded to General McClellan for the Army of the Potomac and the number reported arrived, said, "Sending men to that army is like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. Half of them never get there." End of section 279. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 280 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Georgia Colonel's Costume. On account of this sectional warfare, Senator Mason of Virginia announced his resolve to wear homespun and dispense with Yankee manufactures altogether. That made Lincoln laugh and say, to carry out his idea he ought to go barefoot. If that's the plan, they should begin at the foundation and adopt the well-known Georgian colonel's uniform, a shirt collar and a pair of spurs. In Speech, New England Tour, 1860. End of section 280. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 281 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Course Feed First. Read for LibriVox.org by Andrew Hoots. Secretary Whitney wrote, in July 1861 I was in Washington, where I merely said to President Lincoln, "Everything is drifting into the war, and I guess you will have to put me in the army." He was in the Indian service at the time. The President looked up from his work and said good-humoredly, "I'm making generals now. In a few days I will be making quartermasters, and then I'll fix you." End of section 281. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 282 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Ain't I Glad to Get Out of the Wilderness? Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. Ain't I glad to get out of the wilderness? In the summer of 1862, just when the North was lulled to repose by the note from General McClellan's newsmongers that the people would have a great surprise on the 4th of July, Colonel J.E.B. Stuart, Confederate cavalrist, took about 2,000 picked riders and performed a dash within the hostile lines, which achieved a worldwide admiration. It is necessary to premise that the country was inimical to the defenders of Washington, and the farmers kept secessionists clearly informed on the Federal movements. Besides, the first duty of keeping Washington engrossed all the Union commanders. If by any unexpected movement the rebels occupied the capital long enough to set up their government, Europe would have recognized the stars and bars, and raised the blockade on the cotton ports. Washington was stupefied and terror-stricken when the news came in from the north that the rebel cavalry were cavorting within McClellan's lines. Communication was cut off with him, and the President was heard to say in the general dumbness of consternation, "There is no news from the Army of the Potomac. I do not even know that we have an army." He was himself filled with a universal alarm. His hope was that a bright morning would follow the dark hour, but his faith and belief that God would safely lead them out of the wilderness was not widely shared. The allusion was to the popular army song, taken from the Negro camp meeting repertoire, "Ain't I Glad to Get Out of the Wilderness," which a clergyman had encouragingly chanted a while before. This wilderness was metaphorically spiritual, but all applied the figure to the wilderness of Virginia, where the battles were fought. End of section 282. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 283 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. With Two Guns, Hold Off an Army. Read for LibriVox.org. One Irish artilleryman was left behind, with one gun of his battery, on the wrong bank of the Potomac, when the Union army retreated before Lee. This gunner actually telegraphed direct to the President as his commander-in-chief that, "I have the whole rebel army in my front. Send me another gun, and I assure your honor that they shall not come over." This pleased the President greatly, who answered that the new Horatius was to take counsel with his officer, if he could find him. End of section 283. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 284 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Breaking Up the Little Game. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. Breaking Up the Little Game. In 1862, Washington was full of talk, and no hard cider. There was the laugh of the gossips who would chatter under fire, the chaff talk of pressmen taking things farcically, and the staff talk of the officers envying one another and scheming for places. Too many were still carrying water on both shoulders, and would have welcomed a speedy reconciliation. The President heard that some of the latter voiced the petulant complaint of those weary of the gainless military movements, that the intention was to shift the two armies about till both were exhausted, and, like the peace at any price men, and the still sympathizing pro-slavery tale, a compromise could be effected and slavery saved. He summoned the parties in this public unbosoming before him. Major Turner said that Major John J. Kay, staff officer to General McClellan, was asked why the Unionists had not bagged the rebel army soon after the Battle of Sharpsburg, whereupon he replied, "That was not the game. We should tire ourselves and the rebels out. That was the only way that the Union could be preserved. Then we would come together fraternally, and slavery will be saved." Major Key did not deny the words, but stoutly maintained his loyalty. As McClellan's staff officer, he must have known his leader's policy: no confiscation, and no Emancipation Act, for McClellan hoped, like thousands of conservatives, to bring about reaction in the South. But the President sharply said, with some of his sempiternal humour, "Gentlemen, if there is a game even among Union men to have our army not take any advantage of the enemy it can, it is my object to break up that game." End of section 284. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 285 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Bottom Will Fall Out. General McClellan's delayed advance being, in 1862, not upon Manassas, but upon Yorktown, filled the less enthusiastic of his henchmen with consternation. To the general eye he seemed to have pitched on the very point where the enemy wanted to meet with all the gain in their favor. This direct route to Richmond they had tried to make impregnable. The President, whom McClellan openly thwarted with unconcealed scorn for the civilian, was in profound distress. He called General Franklin into his council and inquired his opinion of the slowness of movements. "If something is not soon done in this dry rot, the bottom will fall out of the whole affair." This was his very saying. The Confederates evacuated Yorktown, but a series of actions ensued, culminating in the massacre at Fair Oaks, where both sides claimed the victory. Soon after, Lincoln took matters in hand, relegating McClellan to one army, and, as commander-in-chief, ordering a general advance. The bottom had fallen out with a vengeance. End of section 285. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 286 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Master of Them Both. Read for LibriVox.org. General McClellan's attitude is such that in the very selfishness of his nature he cannot but wish to be successful, and I hope he will. And the Secretary of War, Stanton, is in precisely the same situation. If the military commanders in the field cannot be successful, not only the Secretary of War, but myself, for the time being master of both, cannot but be failures. Speech, August 6, 1862, at Washington. End of section 286. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 287 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Skeered Virginian. Read for LibriVox.org by Andrew Hoots. A reviewing party, of which the President was the center, was stopped at a railroad by Harper's Ferry to let a locomotive pass and look at the old engine house where John Brown, the raider, was penned in and captured. The little switching engine ran past with much noise and bustle, the engineer blowing the ludicrous whistle in salute to the distinguished visitors. Lincoln referred to the recollections of the scene where old Potawatomi thrilled the natives with panic lest he raised the negroes to revolt, and remarked as the engine flew away, "You call that the Flying Dutchman, do you? They ought to call that thing the Scared Virginian." By General O. Howard, a hearer. End of section 287. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 288 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. He Who Fights and Runs Away. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. He Who Fights and Runs Away. Shortly after the scandalous rout of Bull Run, the participants in the panic began to try to palliate the disgrace. The President, listening with revived sarcasm to the new perversion, remarked, "So it is your notion now that we licked the rebels and then ran away." End of section 288. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 289 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. No Sunday Fighting. Read for LibriVox.org. As the first Battle of Bull Run, a sanguinary defeat to the Unionists, was fought on the Sabbath day, the President forbade in the future important movements on the day desecrated. But with singular inconsistency in a sage so clear-headed, he did not see that the Southerners chuckled, "The better the day, the better the deed," in their victory. End of section 289. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 290 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Let a Good Man Alone. General Howard, in taking command before Washington, incurred the hostility of certain officers of the convivial, plundering, swashbuckling order, who objected to his piety and orderliness. They tramped off to badger the President with their censure; but he who had appreciated the new leader in a glance reproved them, saying, "Howard is a good man. Let him alone. In time he will bring things straight." That was what caused the general to reverence him and love him. End of section 290. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 291 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Blondin Simile. Read for LibriVox.org by Harold Stewart. One of the universal topics of the early 60s was the feats of the acrobat Blondin. This daring rope walker crossed the waters by Niagara Falls on a slack wire. On one occasion he carried a man on his back, to whom he imparted the caution, grappling as with hooks of steel, "If you upset me with trembling, I shall drop you. I shall catch the rope and be safe. As for you, inexperienced one, phut!" The chain of defeats and "flashes in the pan" attending the opening of the campaign, beginning as a march upon Richmond, [Footnote: Some Northern newspapers kept a standing head, "On to Richmond," but eventuating in a defense of Washington, humiliating as was this reverse, promoted all sorts and conditions of men, moneyed, well-grounded, and investing in the new government securities, fluctuating like wildcat stock, to pester the President with jeremiads in council. To one deputation from his home parts he administered this caustic rebuke in such illustration as was habitual to him: "Gentlemen, suppose all the property you were worth was in gold, and you had put it in the hands of Blondin, to carry across the Niagara River on a rope. Would you shake the cable, or keep shouting out to him, 'Blondin, stand up straighter! Blondin, stoop a little more! Go a little faster! Lean a little more to the north, to the south?' No. You would hold your breath as well as your tongue, and keep your hands off all, until he was safe over. The government," [Footnote: Lincoln always used government and U.S. as nouns carrying a plural verb,] "are carrying an immense weight. Untold treasures are in their hands. They are doing the very best they can. Don't pester them. Keep silence, and we will get you safe across." End of section 291. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 292 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. The Pioneer's Land Title. Read for LibriVox.org by Magdalena Cook. The Pioneer's Land Title. Judge Weldon was appointed United States Attorney, acting in Illinois. Being at Washington, some speculators, knowing he was an old friend of the President, engaged him for their side. They wanted to get cotton permits from the Treasury, which was feasible, but made sure that the military would recognize these passes, no doubt, if the President would countersign them. Otherwise, the army officers acted often without regard to trade desires. On broaching the subject to the potentate, on whose lips so much hung at the epoch, the latter brightened up and in his branching off manner said, "By the way, what has become of your friend Robert Lewis?" Lewis was the clerk of court in Illinois, and at home, well and thrifty. "Do you remember," continued the President, "his story about his going to Missouri to look up some Mormon lands belonging to his father?" Whereupon, as Weldon said that he had forgot some details, the storyteller related with unction. This Robert Lewis, on coming of age, found papers in his father's muniments, entitling him as heir to lands in northeastern Missouri, where the Mormons had attempted settling before their enforced exodus. There was no railroad, so Lewis rode out to that part and thought he had located the land. For the night he stopped at a solitary log house. A gruff voice bade him come in, not very hospitably. The owner was a long, lanky man, about 11 feet high, Bob thought. He had a rifle hanging on its hooks over the fireplace, also about 11 feet long, Bob also reckoned. He was interrupted in necking bullets, for they were cast in a mould, and left the little protuberance where the run left off. The first comer had been there some time, and seemed to know the section, but was rather indifferent to the stranger's inquiries about this site of his lands. Teased at this unconcern, so opposite to the usual feeling of settlers who like a neighbour in the lonesomeness, Lewis hastened to lay down the law. He was looking up the paternal purchase. Here were the titles, spreading out the papers. "That is my title, to this section. You are on it. What is yours?" The other had shown some slight interest in the topic by this time. He paused in his occupation and pointed with his long arm to the long rifle, saying, "Young man, do you see that gun? That is my title, and if you do not get out of here pretty quick, you will feel the force of it." Lewis crammed his papers into his saddlebags and rushed out to bestride his pony, but said that the man snapped his gun at him twice before he was out of range. "Now," resumed Mr. Lincoln, "the military authorities have the same title against the civil ones, the guns. The gentlemen themselves may judge what the result is likely to be." Mr. Weldon reported to his employers at Willard's Hotel, and they laughed heartily at the illustration, but they did not proceed with the cotton spec, understanding that would be the administration's policy as well as if a proclamation were issued. By Judge Weldon. End of section 292. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 293 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Read for LibriVox.org by Andrew Hoots. Cheers not military, but I like them. After the disarray of the first Bull Run battle, the President drove out to the camps to rally the boys in the blues. General Sherman was only a colonel, and he had the rudeness of a military man to hint to the visitor that he hoped the orator would not speak so as to encourage cheering and confusion. The President stood up in his carriage and prefaced his speech with this exordium: "Don't cheer, boys. I confess that I rather like it myself, but Colonel Sherman here says it isn't military, and I guess we had better defer to his opinion," with his inimitable wink, which it would have been an independent fortune to a stage comedian. End of section 293. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 294 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Numbering the Hairs of His Tail? Read for LibriVox.org. A congressional committee selected to examine and report upon a new canon produced so voluminous a tome that Lincoln, reviewing it, dropped it in disgust and commented, I should want a new lease of life to read this through. Why can't a committee of this kind occasionally exhibit a grain of common sense? If I send a man to buy a horse for me, I expect him to tell me his points, not how many hairs there are in his tail. Authenticated by Mr. Hubbard, Member of Congress of Connecticut, to whom this remark was addressed. End of section 294. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 295 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. An Unconventional Order. On going over the minor orders, riders, and corrections of the President, it will be seen that he never succumbed to conforming with the stale and set phrases of the civil service documents. For an instance of his unquenchable humor, read the following discharge. 2 brothers, Smiths, of Boston, had been arrested, held, and persecuted for a long period by a military tribunal. The charge was defrauding the government. The hue and cry about the cheating contractors called for a victim, but the chief executive on perusing the testimony concluded that the defendants were guiltless. He wrote the subsequent release. Whereas, Franklin W. and J.C. Smith had transactions with the Navy Department to the amount of $1.25 million, and whereas they had the chance to steal $1 million, and were charged with stealing $2,200, and the question now is stealing $100, I don't believe they stole anything at all. Therefore, the record and findings are disapproved, declared null and void, and the defendants are fully discharged. End of section 295. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 296 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. It occurs to me that I am commander. Read for LibriVox.org by Morgan Dowtrick. It occurs to me that I am commander. To the prairie man, the climate of Washington would be almost tropical. Nevertheless, it participates of American meteorological variability, as old probability would admit. One night, Lincoln, coming out of his rooms at the Executive Mansion to make his nocturnal round, finishing with the call of the latest dispatches at garrison headquarters, noticed, as a fierce gale shook and scourged him with sleet, that a soldier was contending with the storm just outside the outer door. "Young man," said he, turning sharply to him, "you have got a cold job tonight. Step inside and guard there." The soldier stoutly contended, for the colloquy became an argument by Lincoln's delight in debate. He persisted that he was posted there by order and must not bulge save by superior countermand. "Hold on there," cried Lincoln, pleased at the arguer supplying him with a decisive weapon. "It occurs to me that I am commander-in-chief, and so I order you to go inside." End of section 296. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 297 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Compliments is all they do pay. Read for LibriVox.org by Rebecca Case. A paymaster introduced to the President by the United States District Marshal remarked with independence noticeable in the sect, "I have no official business with you, sir. I only called to pay my compliments." "I understand," was the retort. "And from the soldiers' complaints, I think that is all you gentlemen do pay." End of section 297. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 298 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Bail the Potomac with a Spoon. Read for LibriVox.org. There is as pathetic a picture as the old sated Marquis of Queensberry, Thackeray's Staines and History's Old Q, murmuring as he gazed from his window on the unsurpassed view of the Thames Valley, "Oh, this cursed river running on all the day," in President Lincoln watching the broad Potomac, where all was so quiet, and yet the hidden and watchful enemy lined the other bank. A petitioner hemmed him in a corner of the room with this sight, and poured on him the bucket of his woes. The at last irritated worm turned on him and cried, "My poor man, go away, do go away. I cannot meddle in your case. I could as easily bail the Potomac with a teaspoon as attend to all the details of the army. End of section 298. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 299 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. We Shall Beat Them, My Son. Read for LibriVox.org by Bill Elliott. Find me at www.vocability.com. That's VOCALBILLITY.com. We Shall Beat Them, My Son. George W. Curtis, New York editor, called on the president in the first winter of the war with the Illinoisian's friend, Judge Arnold. He said that the official wore a sad, weary, and anxious look and spoke with a softened, touching voice. But he added to his goodbye at the door in shaking hands, with paternal kindness and profound conviction, "We shall beat them, my son. We shall beat them." End of section 299. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 300 of the Lincoln Storybook by Henry L. Williams. Little for so big a business. Before the war, the museums of the Eastern States were regaled by an infant drummer. This lad, Henry W. Stoneman, at the age of 7 or 8, was a proficient on the drum. He was seen by this editor, executing solos of great difficulty, and accompanying the orchestra with variations on his unpromising instrument, which musicians praised and in which he avoided monotony with precocious talent. Grown up, still a rare drummer, he was attached to the Germantown Hospital as a post drummer. At the first inauguration he was with the band and noticed by the President. With his habit of applauding the young, the latter spoke to him, commended his playing, and remarked, "You are a very little man to be in this big business." He took him up, kissed him, and paternally set him down, drum and all. Mr. Stoneman lived to the age of 40 with this pretty memory. End of section 300. This recording is in the public domain.